"You'll never afford this neighborhood," Mom mocked. A week later, her landlord came to introduce their new owner. Me. The day my mother mocked me in front of her neighbors, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I just stood there with a tight smile, clutching the keys in my pocket. Keys to the building she was bragging about like she owned the whole street. She had no idea. She didn't know that a week earlier, I'd finalized the deal. She didn't know that while she was showing off her little rose garden and gossiping about who drives what and who's too poor to live here, I had already bought the property. Her property, including the very house she was renting. And she definitely didn't know that her landlord, the one she always called old and clueless, had retired and asked me to join him for a tenant introduction. So when the new landlord stepped onto her porch, and she was still mid-story about how my daughter works in tech but not real tech, and how I can't even afford a decent zip code, I let her talk. I let her talk until the man next to me cleared his throat and said, "Mrs. Monroe, I'd like you to meet the new owner of this building. Your daughter, Kaya." Her face changed. Fast. I will never forget that moment. Not because it was sweet revenge, not because I finally got the upper hand after years of being overlooked, but because it was the first time my mother looked at me like she was seeing me for real. And for a second, it actually hurt, because deep down I realized she never saw me until she had to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here. How a daughter who was always too quiet, too practical, and not flashy enough, became her mother's landlord. Camera cuts to narrator sitting in a cozy space. Warm lighting, calm music fades in. Tone shifts slightly more reflective. Let me rewind a bit. Growing up, I was never the favorite. That was Chad. My older brother, the golden boy. Charming, loud, always full of ideas, even if most of them crashed and burned. He could do no wrong. I, on the other hand, could do everything right and still be invisible. Got good grades? That's what's expected. Graduated early? Don't brag. Bought my first car? Used? Couldn't you aim a little higher? My mom, Doreen, has always had a thing for appearances. Designer bags, status parties, flashy Facebook posts. She wasn't rich, but she wanted people to think she was. And she treated life like a spotlight. If you didn't shine, you didn't matter. And me, I didn't shine the way she wanted. I was quiet, focused. I worked in software development, not glamorous, not something you can easily brag about at the garden club. I saved instead of splurging. I rented a modest apartment downtown and invested my bonuses into real estate, something I kept to myself. Why? Because every time I tried to share something, my mother would shut it down. So I stopped trying. But that day, on her front lawn, surrounded by neighbors sipping lemonade and fake laughing at her Kaya jokes, something inside me clicked. She had spent her entire life underestimating me, out loud. But this time, I wasn't just walking away. I was walking in, with power, and I didn't need to raise my voice to prove it. All I had to do was stand there, smile politely, and let the silence speak for me. Because sometimes the best clapback isn't loud, it's legal. And it comes with a signed deed and a property portfolio she never thought I could build. So, yeah, that moment, that line, "You'll never afford this neighborhood." I let her say it. I let everyone hear it. Because I knew what was coming next. And when it did, I didn't say, "I told you so." I just said, "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Monroe. I'm your new landlord." People like to talk about normal childhoods, family dinners, game nights, warm hugs before school. My childhood had structure, sure, but it wasn't warm. It was more like presentable. Everything looked perfect from the outside. Our home was neat, the lawn was mowed, the pictures on the wall all perfectly staged. But inside, everything was about appearances. There was no space for softness, no room for who I really was. My name is Kaya Monroe. I'm 29 years old. I'm a senior software developer. I live quietly. I invest smart. I don't chase flash, and I don't need attention. But growing up in the Monroe house, that meant I might as well have been invisible. My mom, Doreen, is what I call socially hungry. She cares deeply about what people think, but not in a kind way. In a what will the neighbors say way. She wasn't abusive in the dramatic movie scene kind of way. It was more subtle, more calculated. And honestly, that might be worse. Because when someone hits you, people see it. When someone slowly chips away at your worth, you end up questioning whether you even deserve to be treated better. My dad, Peter, is a kind man. Or at least he used to be. Somewhere along the way, he learned to survive by staying silent. He never stood up to my mother. Not when she ridiculed me. Not when she played favorites. He just sort of disappeared into the wallpaper. He'd say, "Don't start trouble, Kaya. Just let it go." Then there's Chad, my older brother by 3 years, and Doreen's pride and joy. If Chad made a mistake, it was a learning opportunity. If I made a mistake, it was proof I couldn't handle life. He was reckless, impulsive, always starting some brilliant new venture. One year it was a t-shirt brand, then it was dropshipping, then cryptocurrency. Each time he failed upward, because my mom bailed him out. Every single time. Meanwhile, I got a scholarship, graduated college early, paid my own rent, never asked for help. But Doreen never bragged about me. To her, I was the shy one, the one who never really came out of her shell. No matter what I did, it was never interesting enough to be worth showing off. I remember once, I got promoted at work. It was a big deal. I called her to share the news. You know what she said? "Oh, that's great, honey. But did you hear Chad's podcast got 200 downloads this week?" Like clockwork. So eventually I stopped sharing. I stopped calling. I stopped trying to be seen by someone who had already decided I wasn't worth the spotlight. But I didn't stop building. I worked. Quietly. I saved my money. I learned everything I could about tech, investing, and real estate. While Chad was bouncing between get-rich-quick schemes, I was setting aside every bonus, researching property trends, meeting with agents, and running financial models and spreadsheets late at night. I didn't need anyone to clap for me. I just needed to create something of my own. At 27, I bought my first condo, a tiny one-bedroom in Baltimore. At 28, I bought another, this time in cash. By 29, I was scouting my first multifamily property. And the funny part? No one in my family even knew. To them, I was still the quiet daughter, the one with the little laptop job. And honestly, I liked it that way. Because if you don't expect applause, you never have to depend on it. You just keep moving. So when my mom invited me to her little garden party in her rental neighborhood, after more than a year of barely speaking, I knew something was up. It wasn't a peace offering. It was an audience. She wanted to show me off as a prop. The quiet daughter with a stable job, but not quite the shine of her golden boy. What she didn't know was that I had just made the biggest purchase of my life, a purchase that would make her speechless. And in that moment, standing on her freshly trimmed lawn, listening to her brag about Chad's latest nonsense while tossing digs at me, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just smiled. Because I knew something she didn't. I wasn't just surviving her anymore. I was standing on the threshold of owning the very space she thought I didn't belong in. It's easy to miss dysfunction when it's dressed up as discipline. In our house, we didn't scream. We didn't slam doors. We didn't talk about feelings. What we did do was perform. We performed politeness at dinner. We performed success for the neighbors. And behind all that smiling, there were rules. Unspoken ones. Ones that only applied to me. There were 2 different sets of expectations in the Monroe household, one for Chad and one for me. When Chad stayed out late, it was boys will be boys. When I was 5 minutes late from school, that's how girls ruin their reputations. When Chad blew his savings on a pyramid scheme, Mom called it a rough patch. When I invested in a rental property and didn't tell her, I was being secretive and disrespectful. It wasn't just favoritism, it was control, and it started early. I was 9 when I got my first silent treatment. I didn't even know what I had done. One minute we were shopping for school shoes, and the next, she was cold, quiet, distant. All because I said I liked sneakers instead of the patent leather shoes she picked out. I didn't realize it then, but that was her way of training me: comply or get frozen out. By the time I hit high school, I had learned the routine: apologize for things I didn't do, dress how she wanted, smile at her friends, never outshine Chad, never ever make her look bad. Looking back, I don't think my mother ever really saw me as a person. She saw me as a reflection she wanted to control, polish, and show off, if I fit the image she wanted. And when I didn't, she erased me. She never hit me. She didn't need to. Her tools were more effective: comparison, criticism, and conditional love. Chad was the golden child, the risk taker, the man of the house in her eyes, even though I was the one holding things together. I helped with bills in college. I babysat my cousin's kids so she could attend charity events. I picked up groceries when Dad forgot. But none of that made me worthy of pride. Not in her eyes. I was too quiet, too serious, too plain, and worst of all, too independent. She hated that about me. She hated that I didn't need her, that I didn't dress for her approval, that I could stand on my own and still breathe. To her, that was rebellion. Even my relationship with my father became a quiet casualty. He wasn't cruel, but he was weak. I know that sounds harsh, but it's true. He loved me, I think, but he loved peace more. And peace in our home meant keeping Doreen happy, which meant staying out of the way when she cut me down. So I learned not to talk. Not about my dreams, not about my wins. Definitely not about money. I became a master at hiding joy, because joy got turned into mockery. Or worse, jealousy. The day I closed on my first condo, I told my best friend Rhea, I told my boss, I told the realtor. But not my mom, because I knew exactly what she'd say. Oh, must be nice to have that kind of luck. Or just make sure it doesn't fall apart like most first-time buyers. Or worse. What did you have to do to afford that? That was her signature move, cutting the knees out from under every good thing I did. So I stayed silent. I built my life in the quiet. Because silence is survivable. But what I didn't realize, at least not yet, was that silence doesn't heal. It doesn't protect you from harm. It just buries it. And the resentment? It grows in that silence like mold under wallpaper. By the time I reached my late 20s, I was tired of being the strong one. Tired of earning respect in every room except the one I grew up in. Tired of being polite when I felt invisible. Tired of proving myself in silence while watching Chad be celebrated for failure. I wasn't angry. Not yet. But I was close. And all it would take to push me over the edge was one sentence, one little comment at a garden party, and then I'd be done playing the quiet daughter. It had been over a year since I last set foot in my parents' home. Not because of a big fight. No shouting match. No dramatic exit. Just silence. Distance. After our last phone call, where I tried to set a boundary and got accused of being cold and disrespectful, I decided I was done begging to be treated like a grown adult. So when I got the invitation to my mother's spring garden social, I almost deleted it. It came in the form of a text, of course. No apology, no warmth. Just, hosting a few neighbors this Saturday. Would be good for you to come. Bring something. I should have said no, but part of me, some tiny part still aching to be seen, said yes. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be different. It wasn't. When I pulled up to their rental house in Maple Glen, the first thing I noticed was how perfectly curated everything looked. Tulips in full bloom, white folding chairs arranged in rows, a table with matching pastel cloths and delicate lemon bars placed just so, and there was my mom, Doreen, in a floral dress, sunglasses perched like a crown, laughing too loudly. Chad was already there. He always showed up for these things, not because he cared, but because he knew she'd make it about him. He spotted me first. "Hey, sis," he said with his usual smirk. "Mom told me you were finally coming out of hiding. Nice of you to show up." I smiled, thin and tight. I brought a bottle of sparkling elderflower lemonade. I thought it'd be a classy touch. Mom looked at it, turned to her neighbor, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Kaya always brings the most interesting things. So, untraditional." That was her way of saying weird. The rest of the afternoon was more of the same. Chad going on about his media startup, which, from what I could gather, was just a YouTube channel where he reacts to conspiracy videos in a suit. My mom eating it up, telling her friends how he's so entrepreneurial. And me? I just sat there, sipping lemonade, listening, smiling politely, until it happened. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Tinsley, I think, asked me, "So, Kaya, where do you live these days?" I said, "I'm in the city, but I've been looking at some properties out this way." Before I could even finish, Mom laughed. Not just a giggle, a laugh. That performative, dismissive kind that makes people shift uncomfortably in their chairs. She waved her hand like I'd told the best joke of the day. "Oh, Kaya, sweetie, this neighborhood's a little out of your range, don't you think?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Everyone looked at me. Some smiled awkwardly. One woman even chuckled. I think she thought we were all in on the joke. But I wasn't. I wasn't embarrassed. I was angry. Not the fiery, explosive kind of anger. This was a cold, crystal clear kind of anger. The kind that comes from decades of being dismissed, undercut, and publicly humiliated by someone who's supposed to love you. I wanted to say something, to snap back, to expose her ignorance. But instead, I smiled, because I remembered something in that moment, something important. She didn't know. She didn't know that the building her house was part of had just been listed for sale. She didn't know that I'd made an offer. She didn't know that it had been accepted 2 days ago. She didn't know that in 5 days I'd be the legal owner of her home. She had no idea I'd been quietly building something that she would never be able to mock, minimize, or manipulate. So I didn't fight. I didn't argue. I just said, "You're right, Mom. This neighborhood really is something." She smiled, proud of her little victory, and I held that moment in my chest like a secret. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't loud. It's watching the person who always tried to keep you small realize they underestimated the wrong daughter. I didn't cry in front of them. Not even when my mom laughed at me like I was the punchline of her little suburban sitcom. I waited until I was halfway down the block, parked under a quiet maple tree, the same one I used to pass when I'd ride my bike as a kid. I put the car in park, turned off the ignition, and just sat there. My hands were trembling. Not with rage, not exactly. It was something more complicated, something heavier, like anger mixed with exhaustion, grief and shame, all braided together so tight I couldn't tell where one ended and the next began. I had spent the whole afternoon letting my mother treat me like an outsider in my own story. Again. Even after all I'd accomplished. Even after building a life on my own terms, paying for my education, investing in property, and rising up the ranks in a career she didn't even understand, she still saw me as less. Not enough. And what hurt most wasn't the laughter. It was how natural it felt to be humiliated by her. Like my body didn't even flinch anymore. Like it had been trained over the years to accept it, absorb it, bury it. I leaned back in the seat and stared up at the ceiling of the car, my chest tight. Why did I even go? Why did I keep giving her the chance to make me feel small? Some part of me, buried deep, still wanted her approval. Or maybe not approval, just recognition. To be seen. Not as an ornament. Not as a joke. But as a full human being. A daughter who was worthy of pride, even if I didn't wear the right kind of success on my sleeve. I thought about all the times I'd told myself I didn't care. That I'd outgrown her, her opinions, her barbed comments. But sitting there in that car, I realized something terrifying. I still cared. Even after everything, I still wanted her to say, "I'm proud of you, Kaya." And she never had. Not once. That realization cracked something open in me. I didn't sob. I didn't wail. But the tears came anyway. Silent and slow. Like they'd been waiting a long time for permission to fall. I wiped them away quickly. almost angrily. I didn't want to sit in sadness. I wanted to move, to do something. I started the car and drove home, my mind racing. On the outside, I probably looked calm, cool, like nothing could touch me. But on the inside, I was unraveling. And underneath all that unraveling was a single, steady thought. Enough. Enough pretending it doesn't hurt. Enough giving her space in my life that she hasn't earned. Enough acting like silence is strength. Because silence wasn't strength. Not anymore. It was hiding. And I was done hiding. That night, I pulled out the packet from the real estate agent. The building my mother lived in. The one with 4 rental units, including hers, was scheduled to close in less than a week. The paperwork was done. The financing was approved. All that was left were signatures and a final walkthrough. It had started out as a smart business decision. Good location, solid rental history, low maintenance needs. But now? Now it felt like fate had handed me a moment. Not for revenge, but for reclamation. A chance to take control of the narrative, to stop playing the daughter who needed permission to be powerful. I lit a candle, opened my laptop, and started organizing documents. Lease agreements, property management contacts, closing statements. It was all there. By the time the sun came up, I hadn't slept, but I wasn't tired. For the first time in a long time, I felt awake, clear, sharp. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was choosing how this story would end. And the next time I stood in front of my mother, it wouldn't be as her quiet daughter trying to be good enough. It would be as the woman she never saw coming. That morning felt different, not because the sun was brighter or the coffee tasted better, but because I was different. After years of shrinking, bending, overperforming, and under-asking, something inside me had finally shifted. The mask cracked, and I wasn't interested in gluing it back together. For most of my life, I'd believed that being good would earn me love. That if I didn't complain, didn't make waves, stayed responsible, respectful, self-reliant, that would finally make her proud. But it never did. And I realized something in the stillness of that morning that stopped me cold. She wasn't proud of me, not because I failed, but because I didn't need her. My mother thrived on dependence. She needed someone to mold, to correct, to control. And Chad? He gave her that. He gave her chaos to fix, drama to retell. He kept her feeling important. I never did. I took care of myself, quietly, efficiently. And instead of being celebrated for that, I was treated like a problem, because I didn't make her feel needed. And the minute I understood that, the whole narrative cracked open. I saw how the pattern stretched far beyond that garden party. Every decision I made, what I wore, how I spoke, how much success I hid, was shaped around minimizing her reactions. I wasn't living freely. I was living around her. And that wasn't empowerment. That was survival. But I wasn't a scared girl anymore. I was a grown woman, a homeowner, a businesswoman, someone who had turned her silence into strategy, her pain into precision. And I was tired of pretending I wasn't powerful just to make other people comfortable. That week, I started journaling every night, something I hadn't done since college. I needed to put words to what I'd been carrying for decades. I wrote things I'd never dared to say out loud. You made me feel invisible. You taught me love was something I had to earn by being useful. I was never hard to love. You were just unwilling to love me as I was. It felt like bleeding, but it also felt like healing. I reread old emails from my mother, the passive-aggressive ones masked as advice. I finally saw them clearly for what they were, tools of control. Then I pulled up old bank records and scanned the real estate contracts again. I hadn't just bought a property. I had built a future, without handouts, without applause, without her permission, and not out of spite, but out of clarity. I started doing something new too. When I walked past mirrors, I didn't just check my hair or makeup. I looked myself in the eyes and said, You're not broken. You were just raised in a house that didn't know how to love you. That became my new ritual. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about liberation. And with every lease document I reviewed, every email exchanged with the property manager, I felt my spine straighten. I wasn't hiding anymore. I wasn't waiting for her to change. She'd built her world out of fantasy, out of control, out of denial, and I was building mine out of truth. Even if it was hard, even if it meant disappointing her, even if it meant losing the little scraps of connection I had fought so hard to keep. Because staying small just to be tolerated is not love. It's emotional poverty, and I was done living in debt to her expectations. I wasn't walking into that house as her daughter anymore. I was walking in as her landlord. And more importantly, as myself, fully, finally, unapologetically. I didn't storm out of that garden party. I didn't confront my mom. I didn't call her out or demand an apology. That wasn't my style, and honestly, it wouldn't have changed anything. She didn't respect noise. She respected control. So I gave her what she understood: quiet, decisive power. The day after the party, I met with my realtor and signed the final documents. I wired the remaining funds for the down payment. No loans, no cosigners, no help, just me. I became the legal owner of the 4-unit property my mother was renting in. Her unit was on the second floor, tucked between 2 elderly tenants who'd lived there since before I graduated high school. I didn't tell her. I didn't need to. What mattered was that I had taken something intangible, years of humiliation, manipulation, and emotional rejection, and turned it into something concrete, something that couldn't be dismissed or laughed off: a deed, a title, a legal transfer of power. I hired a professional property management company, not to create distance, but to make sure it was handled like a real business. I didn't want personal feelings involved. I didn't want revenge disguised as professionalism. I wanted structure, legitimacy. They sent out new welcome packets, lease transfer notices, scheduled routine inspections, and then I made one request: that I be present for the introduction meeting with each tenant. When they asked if I was sure, I said yes. It wasn't about rubbing it in. It wasn't about the moment itself. It was about closing a chapter that had haunted me for years. In the meantime, I reviewed every lease. I made notes. I treated it like any other property, because that's what it was. My mother was just one tenant among 4. She wasn't special here. That was part of the point. I didn't have to explain myself to her anymore. I didn't have to prove I was capable. I didn't have to convince her to treat me with dignity. I had already given that to myself, and that's all that mattered now. When the day of the introduction came, I dressed professionally. Not flashy, just clean, put together, and intentional. I didn't want to look like I was trying to make a point. I just wanted to look like myself. My property manager met me in front of the building. He handed me a clipboard and said, "You good?" I nodded. I was more than good. We visited each unit, one by one. Friendly hellos, small talk, a few handshakes, and finally, my mother's unit. The moment she opened the door, her eyes went from warm to confused to stunned. She saw me standing next to the manager with a clipboard and an easy smile. She blinked twice, like she was trying to recalculate what reality she was in. Before she could speak, the property manager introduced me the same way he had every other time. "Doreen Monroe, this is Ms. Kaya Monroe. She's the new owner of the building." That's when I saw it. The silence. The collapse of the smug mask she wore so easily. The calculation in her eyes trying to understand how this had happened. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The quiet filled the space like thunder. After a beat, I extended my hand. "Nice to see you again, Mom." The property manager, bless him, kept talking, walking her through the updates, the tenant portal, the contact info, business as usual. I just stood there, steady, calm, watching her try to wrap her head around the fact that the daughter she mocked now owned the floor beneath her feet. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't vengeful. I was professional, because I didn't come for revenge. I came for my dignity, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me again. Not even her. Not ever. After the initial introduction, my mom barely said a word. She nodded through the walkthrough, her mouth tight, her eyes darting between me and the property manager like she was waiting for someone to explain that it was all a joke. But it wasn't a joke. It was real. After we finished reviewing the lease updates, the manager excused himself to check on the plumbing in one of the other units. That left just the two of us standing in her living room, me near the door, her by the window, still in her gardening gloves. It was the first time in years we were alone without a holiday or a crisis forcing it. She finally spoke. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "How did this happen?" I almost laughed, because I'd heard that question before, but usually after some cruel comment she'd pretend never landed. Only this time she meant it literally. I looked at her fully. No armor. No hesitation. "I bought the building, Mom. The owner was retiring. I made an offer. I had the money. I closed on it last week." She blinked. "You bought this?" she repeated, like the words tasted foreign. Why would you do that?" That was the moment. The moment I could have said everything I'd wanted to scream for years. Because why would I? Why would the daughter who never did anything right suddenly be in charge of the property she once said I'd never afford? Why would the girl she ignored at every family dinner, the one she laughed at in front of guests, the one she always warned would never make it out there on her own, be standing here, holding the keys to her lease? Why would I? So I told her the truth. Not in a dramatic way. Not with yelling. Just clearly. Honestly. "I bought it because it was a smart investment. And yes, I knew you lived here. But that wasn't the reason. That was just a detail." She didn't believe me. I could see it in her face. She still thought this was about proving something. About getting back at her. But it wasn't. "I didn't buy this to get even," I said. "I bought it because I stopped waiting for your approval. And when I stopped waiting, I started building." She stared at me, the gloves still on her hands, like she hadn't figured out how to remove them. Then she snapped. "This is about the garden party, isn't it? You're still upset I embarrassed you. That's what this is. You're trying to humiliate me." I let out a breath. "I'm not trying to humiliate you, Mom. I just stopped letting you humiliate me." That landed. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way. You've always been sensitive." I smiled. Not cruelly, but knowingly. "I'm not sensitive. You're just not used to being around people who hold you accountable." The silence between us was thick. She looked smaller now. Not weak, just human. Maybe for the first time. And I realized something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Pity. She'd spent her whole life clinging to image, to superiority, to control, and none of it had protected her from the truth. I didn't hate her. I just didn't need her permission anymore. I walked to the door, turned back once. "I'm not raising the rent. Your lease is safe. The only thing that's changing," I said, "is that you'll have to get used to seeing me as I am, not as who you want me to be." She didn't respond, and that was fine. Because the most powerful thing I ever did wasn't owning her home. It was owning my story. Without apology. Without fear. Without her voice being louder than mine. There was never a moment where I screamed, "I won." There was no need. Victory, for me, didn't look like slamming doors or cutting the lease short. It didn't look like revenge or eviction notices. It looked like walking out of that building with my back straight and my heart still intact. It looked like choosing calm over chaos. Boundaries over bitterness. After that day, I kept everything strictly professional. I let the property manager handle communications, maintenance requests, lease updates, quarterly inspections. It all went through the system, like every other tenant. I treated her just like the others, which, in a strange way, was the loudest statement I could make, because for once she wasn't getting special treatment. She wasn't in charge, and she wasn't the sun everyone had to orbit. She was just a name on a file. And I didn't say that to be cruel. I did it because it was the only way I could protect the peace I had fought so hard to earn. A few weeks after the introduction, I received an email. It was from her. Short, tense. But something in the wording gave me pause. It said, "I've decided to stay through the end of the lease. I assume you'll give proper notice if you intend to raise the rent. I'll make sure to keep up with payments. Doreen." No love, Mom. No questions, no digs. Just cold, careful distance. And I was okay with that. Because emotional detachment was something she had mastered. I was just finally learning it for myself, without guilt. That week, I sat alone in the backyard of the property, the same yard where she once mocked me in front of her neighbors. I brought a folding chair, a journal, and a small bottle of sparkling water. The sky was pale blue. There was a soft breeze. The tulips she loved were still blooming. It was the same setting, but the weight had lifted. I watched a couple of the other tenants pass by. One waved politely. The older man from the corner unit smiled and said he appreciated the upgraded lighting in the hallway. Small, simple wins. And I realized something. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about me. About building something steady. Something real. Something I didn't have to shrink inside of. That day, I took out my journal and wrote something I hadn't said aloud before. You were wrong about me, and I forgive you, but I don't owe you my softness anymore. I closed the journal and leaned back in my chair, and for the first time in years I felt free. Not because she changed, not because she apologized, but because I had finally stopped waiting for either of those things to happen. I gave myself the closure she never could. I didn't kick her out. I didn't slam a metaphorical door in her face. I simply stood in my truth. She had spent years telling me I wasn't enough. Not bold enough. Not stylish enough. Not successful enough. But now, she was living in a home I owned. And not once did I have to raise my voice to make that clear. Because when you truly know your worth, you don't need to argue it. You just live it. And let everyone else adjust accordingly. You know what surprised me the most? It wasn't how my mom reacted. It wasn't her silence, or her cold emails, or her refusal to acknowledge what happened. It was how many people did. People I didn't even realize had been watching my journey from the sidelines. The day after the lease transfer, I called Rhea, my best friend since college. She'd been my one constant through breakups, job changes, and every one of my family-induced meltdowns. I hadn't told her about the purchase ahead of time, not because I didn't trust her, but because I needed to keep it mine until I was ready. When I told her everything, the property, the party, the moment on the porch, she went completely silent, and then she screamed, "You're telling me you're her landlord now? Kaya, I've never been prouder of anyone in my life." She didn't stop there. She showed up that weekend with a bottle of champagne and takeout from our favorite Thai spot, and we sat on the floor of my apartment like we were 22 again, laughing between bites of drunken noodles. But this time, I wasn't the underdog. I was the one who had pulled it off. Quietly, cleanly, powerfully. Rhea toasted to me. To the woman who made her own table, and then bought the damn building. I didn't cry, but my chest ached in the best way. That's what real support feels like. Not loud, not performative, just real. Then there was Aunt Nina, my dad's sister. She and my mom were never close, for obvious reasons. Nina was everything my mom wasn't. Calm, grounded, emotionally intelligent. She sent me a card, a physical card. Who even does that anymore? Inside, in her loopy cursive handwriting, she wrote, "I always knew you had a quiet strength. Your mom never wanted to see it, but I did. I'm proud of you, Kaya. Truly. Love, Aunt Nina." I stared at that card for a long time. It felt like being seen through clean glass instead of a funhouse mirror. Even my coworkers, some of whom barely knew the full story, noticed something had shifted. One of the senior engineers pulled me aside after a team meeting and said, "I don't know what you did or changed, but you're walking different. Keep going." And he was right. I was walking differently. Lighter. Straight. Like I wasn't dragging shame behind me anymore. Even my boss, who'd once made a throwaway joke about how quiet I was during presentations, complimented my leadership during a complex rollout. "You've got presence," she said. "People follow quiet strength more than you think." I tucked that compliment away too, like a stone in my pocket. Something solid to hold on to when old wounds tried to resurface. And perhaps the most unexpected validation came from one of the tenants in the building, Mr. Halverson, an older man in Unit 1. He'd lived there for over 25 years, the kind of neighbor who watered his plants at the same time every day and greeted everyone with a nod. After our second inspection, he caught me outside. "You the new owner, right?" I nodded, bracing for a complaint. Instead, he smiled. "Good. Building's in better hands now. You've got the eyes of someone who pays attention." I thanked him, quietly stunned, because that's all I'd ever wanted growing up. For someone to notice I was paying attention. That I cared. That I showed up, even if I didn't do it loudly. Support doesn't always come in huge moments. Sometimes it arrives in text messages, in shared meals, in the way someone looks at you like they see you. Not just your reflection, but your intention. I hadn't grown up feeling surrounded. But now? Now I was beginning to see that I had built a different kind of family. Not the kind I was born into. The kind I chose, and the kind that chose me back. I never planned on exposing anyone. That was never the goal. I wasn't interested in humiliating my mother or broadcasting my brother's failures. I didn't need the world to see what I'd lived through. But life has a way of revealing what people try so hard to hide. All you have to do is stop covering for them. It started small. A few weeks after the lease transfer, I heard through Rhea, who had mutual acquaintances in my mom's social circle, that word had gotten out. Not from me. I had said nothing. But Maple Glen is the kind of neighborhood where gossip travels faster than logic. Apparently, Mrs. Tinsley, the same neighbor who had asked me what I did for a living at the garden party, was the first to say it aloud. "Did you hear Doreen's daughter bought the building?" My mom, true to form, tried to spin it. "Oh, Kaya? She's just helping manage things. It's not her property, really. She works with a group." It might have worked, if it hadn't been so easy to disprove. When tenants started getting notices on official letterhead with my full name on them, it became harder to lie. A week later, the gossip shifted. "She's the owner, not a manager." And suddenly, those same women who used to laugh at my mother's jabs were now asking questions she didn't want to answer. It was subtle at first. A few women stopped showing up to her morning walks. A neighbor who used to linger in her garden started keeping her headphones in. Nothing dramatic, just distance. Her power, built on appearances, began to erode. But what surprised me most was Chad. Because the second my name started carrying a different kind of weight, the second I became the one who owns, he changed his tone completely. He texted me, "Hey sis, just heard you bought Mom's building. That's pretty impressive. Let me know if you ever want to partner on something. I've got ideas." Partner. That was the word he used. The same brother who never once showed interest in my work, who used to roll his eyes anytime I mentioned coding or contracts, suddenly wanted to collaborate. I didn't respond. A week later, I found out he had tried to pitch his latest business idea to one of the tenants in the building. Mr. Halverson let me know, politely but clearly. "Some guy named Chad tried to sell me on a crypto podcast. Said you were backing him." I nearly laughed out loud. Because of course he did. Of course he tried to use my name now that it meant something.
That was Chad's survival tactic. He always found someone to carry the weight he refused to bear himself. For years, it had been Mom, but now? She had her own reputation to manage, and it was slipping. Because people talk. They started piecing things together. The failed businesses, the borrowing, the contradictions between what she bragged about and what was real. Someone asked her at a brunch, "Didn't you say Chad's company was doing great? I thought he was living in DC now." And she froze. Because he wasn't. He was living with her again, trying to rebrand failure as a fresh start. And this time she didn't have an easy script to hide behind. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. They exposed themselves, not because I revealed secrets, but because I stopped protecting their version of the story. For the first time, I wasn't defending them. I wasn't downplaying the pain. I wasn't letting anyone think I was just the quiet daughter who didn't do much with her life. I had stepped into the light, and without me holding up their illusions, the cracks became visible to everyone. People stopped asking why I had distanced myself from my family. They started asking how I had made it out, and the answer was simple. I stopped pretending brokenness was normal. I stopped calling it just how she is. I stopped laughing off the cruelty. And without my silence to shield them, the truth stood on its own. There's this moment that happens after everything falls apart, when the silence gets louder than the drama ever was. That's where I found myself. Not in chaos, but in clarity. After the lease transfer, after the confrontation, after the rumors faded and the neighborhood's curiosity moved on to something else, I was left with one, still burning question. Who am I now that I don't have to prove myself to anyone? For years, I defined my worth by how well I could survive other people's expectations. I was always trying to be the right version of myself in the wrong environment, hoping that if I was just successful enough, quiet enough, dependable enough, my mother would finally see me, hear me, love me in a way that wasn't conditional or transactional. But when none of that worked, I had a choice to make. I could keep performing, or I could let the performance die. And once I stopped trying to be the better daughter, I discovered something more powerful than approval: peace. Peace didn't look like perfection. It didn't mean my relationship with my family magically healed. It didn't mean I never felt pain or doubt again. It meant I finally stopped needing to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding me. It meant I built my life on values I actually believed in. Not obedience, not image, not control, but truth, boundaries, respect, and softness that didn't require sacrifice. I started living differently, and not in a dramatic, new year, new me kind of way. It was subtle, steady. I stopped explaining myself when people questioned my choices. I started saying no without apologizing. I made time for joy, not just productivity. I picked up painting again. I joined a book club. I started cooking for pleasure instead of just survival. And I forgave myself for the years I spent trying to earn what should have been given freely, because I finally understood. The love I wanted from my mother wasn't actually love. It was control disguised as concern. And the moment I stopped needing it, I became free to love myself on my own terms. It's funny how that works. When you stop chasing the approval of people who'll never give it, you make room for people who already see your worth. People like Ria, like Aunt Nina, like the little girls I mentor in tech now, girls who remind me every day that we don't have to harden to be strong. We just have to root ourselves in something real. One of them, a 12-year-old named Bree, gave me a sticky note after a workshop. On it, she'd written, "Thank you for being the kind of adult I want to become." I kept that note on my fridge, because that's my new metric for success. Not whether my mom is finally proud of me, not whether my brother suddenly respects me, but whether I've become the kind of woman I needed when I was younger, and I have. I don't need to fix them. I don't need them to admit they were wrong. I don't even need them to like me. I just need to keep living in alignment with the woman I've become, the woman who turned silence into structure, pain into power, and dismissal into dignity. That is enough. I am enough. Not because I own a property, not because I flipped the power dynamic, but because I finally learned how to own myself, fully, gently, without asking for permission. And in that kind of ownership, there is a quiet power no one can take away, not even her. I didn't want my life to be about what she did to me. That was the first real shift. For a while, it was easy to make her the center of my story. After all, she was the one I'd been orbiting my whole life, trying to earn her approval, avoid her shame, anticipate her moods. But once that orbit broke, once I stood on my own ground, I had to ask myself something scarier than, what did she do to me? I had to ask, what do I want now that she's no longer steering the wheel? And honestly, I didn't know right away. I spent a few weeks letting the dust settle, managing the property, keeping my head down at work. But inside, something was stirring. Something I hadn't allowed myself to think about for years. Not just surviving, not just escaping, but thriving. I began by setting new intentions, not grand, sweeping goals. Just small, solid steps toward a life that actually felt like mine. I expanded my work as a mentor for girls in tech. What had started as a once-a-month Zoom call turned into a real initiative. I partnered with a local nonprofit to host coding workshops for middle school girls. We didn't just teach them how to write lines of code, we taught them how to take up space in rooms that never expected them. And every time I stood at the front of a classroom, I saw pieces of myself in their eyes. The quiet ones. The ones who said sorry too often before asking questions. The ones who knew more than they let on, but had already been taught to shrink. They were me, years ago. And now, I was the proof that you could outgrow all of that. That quiet could be powerful. That success didn't have to be loud or dramatic to be real. I also started investing differently. Not just in real estate, but in community. I bought another property, this time in a more affordable neighborhood, and made a conscious choice to work with tenants who were starting over. Families in transition. Young people with dreams and limited resources. I partnered with a housing advocate to keep the rent reasonable, even when the market surged. Because I didn't just want to own buildings, I wanted to create stability for people who needed it the most. Something I wish I'd had, not in money, but in spirit. And I named that property fund after my grandmother, my mom's mom, Lena, who was the only woman in my family who ever gave me unconditional love. She died when I was 15, but I remember her voice like it was yesterday. "You don't have to be loud to be heard, baby," she used to say. "You just have to mean what you say." Now, her name was on every letterhead, every lease, every agreement I signed, legacy, the real kind. Not the kind that comes from family name or status, but from values, from the impact you leave behind. I wasn't trying to create a perfect life, I was trying to create a true one. And that meant keeping my circle small, my boundaries firm, and my heart open to the kind of relationships that actually fed me, not drained me. Ria remained my rock, Aunt Nina, my quiet North Star. And slowly, I began building friendships where I didn't have to wear armor. Where my softness wasn't seen as weakness, but as depth. For the first time in my adult life, I started sleeping through the night without waking up in anxiety. I stopped second-guessing every email I sent. I stopped rehearsing conversations that hadn't even happened yet, because I was no longer living in reaction to anyone. I was creating forward, deliberately, slowly, authentically. That was the real win, not owning a building, but owning my time, owning my peace, owning my future, on my terms. And every day I wake up and live, that truth is a kind of justice that no one can take away from me, not even her. It happened on a Tuesday. I was finishing up emails in a coffee shop near the property, just wrapping up a tenant maintenance request and finalizing details for an upcoming workshop. My schedule was full, but my heart was quiet. That was still new for me. And then my phone lit up. Dad. We hadn't spoken in over 6 months. The last time we exchanged words was at the garden party, and even then, it was a polite hello and a long silence. He wasn't part of the main conflict, but that was the problem. He was never really part of anything. Just there. Watching. Quiet. Unwilling to stand in the way, even when it mattered most.
I let the call go to voicemail, but he texted a minute later. "Would you be open to coffee?" Just me. No drama. I stared at the message for a long time, and then I said yes. We met at a diner, the kind he used to take me to after school when Mom was out doing God knows what. Back when I was little, and he still tried to be present before retreating into silence. He looked older than I remembered, a little more tired around the eyes. He smiled when he saw me, tentative, like he wasn't sure he had the right. "Thanks for meeting me," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd come." I shrugged. "Me neither." We made small talk for a bit. Weather. Work. The usual filler. Then he took a deep breath. "I heard about the building. What you did." I nodded. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," I said. "But I could." And I did. He nodded again, this time slower. Then, after a long pause, he said, I should have done more. Back then, I should have said something. I should have defended you more. I just didn't know how. That hit harder than I expected. Not because it fixed anything, but because it was the first time he ever acknowledged that he hadn't. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't cry. He didn't twist the story to protect himself. He just owned it. And that meant more than any grand apology ever could. We didn't hug. We didn't cry into our coffee. But when we stood to leave, he said, I hope you know I'm proud of you. I should have said it sooner. I said thank you. And I meant it. Not because it made up for the past, but because I'd finally stopped needing him to. A few weeks later, my mom sent a card. No message, just a birthday card. Generic, impersonal, but signed. Love, Mom. That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement. But still, it was something. And I had a choice. I could throw it away and pretend it didn't matter. Or I could accept it for what it was. Not a healing gesture, but a quiet signal. Maybe not remorse, but recognition. So I left it on the shelf. Not because I forgave her in full, but because I'd forgiven myself enough to stop needing her to. We haven't had a real conversation since that day on her porch. I don't expect one either. If she ever reaches out again, I'll meet her with boundaries. I'll protect the peace I built. I'll keep the door cracked, not for her, but for me. Because healing doesn't always end with reconciliation. Sometimes it ends with neutrality, with distance that doesn't ache anymore, with love that's quiet and conditional, and still okay. I don't hate her. I don't love her the way I used to either. What I feel now is something softer. Understanding, maybe. Pity sometimes. But mostly just freedom. The kind that says, I don't need you to change for me to be whole. That's reconciliation, in its truest form. Not a hug. Not a dramatic reunion. Just a calm knowing that I am no longer at war with who I came from. Because I've finally made peace with who I've become. This story could have ended with a door slam. It could have ended with me evicting her, cutting off my family completely, walking away triumphant and untouched. But real life is rarely that clean. And I don't want to pretend I walked through this without scars. Because I didn't. I'm still healing, still unlearning, still catching myself bracing for criticism that never comes, even when I'm in rooms full of love now. But here's the thing. I'm no longer living in reaction to pain. I'm living from a place of truth. And that's what I want anyone listening to this to know. You don't have to become bitter to be strong. You don't have to become cruel to create boundaries. You don't have to punish people to rise above them. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is move forward without needing revenge. Because healing isn't about making them sorry. It's about making yourself free. When I look back at that garden party now, I don't feel rage anymore. I feel a strange gratitude. Not for what they did, but for what it taught me. That moment exposed what I had outgrown. It revealed who I'd been pretending to be just to keep the peace. And it forced me to stop hiding behind being the bigger person and start becoming the truer one. I don't need my mother to say she was wrong. She probably never will. I don't need Chad to admit he coasted on a double standard. He still is. And that's okay. Because I've reclaimed the one thing I used to let them decide for me. My worth. I own it now, quietly, firmly, completely. And you know what's funny? The win wasn't buying the building. It wasn't becoming her landlord. It was sitting alone in my own apartment, one night, a week after all the dust had settled. No noise, no drama, no tension, and feeling peace settle in like a warm blanket. It was that first night I slept all the way through without dreaming of arguments that never got resolved. That first morning I looked in the mirror and didn't brace for judgment, hers or mine. That first deep breath that didn't carry weight from the past. That's what freedom feels like. Not flashy, not dramatic, just quiet and complete. So if you're watching this and you've been the overlooked one, the underestimated one, The one made to feel too quiet, too sensitive, too not enough. Please hear me. You are not too much. You are not too little. You are exactly enough. And you don't have to keep waiting for someone to say you're worthy to start acting like it. You get to decide. You get to walk away. You get to rebuild from truth, not fear. Because power doesn't always come in a roar. Sometimes it comes in a whispered no, a boundary held, a breath not wasted, a life reimagined. That's what I built. Not just a portfolio, not just a career, but a legacy I can live inside of. Every day I walk through this world knowing that I didn't just survive what tried to silence me. I outgrew it, and I became the woman they never saw coming, because I finally saw myself. So if you're still waiting to be seen, to be heard, to be chosen, start with you. Choose yourself first. Choose yourself loud enough that the world has no choice but to listen. Because sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is heal quietly and live well. And if this story spoke to something in you, leave a comment. Share your story. You are not alone. There's more than one way to break a cycle, and maybe your story starts now.